Good day and thank you for coming back to Learning Language Arts channel. We are talking today once again about the ACT, in particular the English grammar section, tips and tricks on how to do well on that part of the test. As you can see, we're on our part 2 of the 3-part videos. Part 1 on last time, what we had talked about was subject and verb agreement, the different types of punctuation, and how to figure out which ones would be the correct answer. In today's video, we're going to be looking at sentence structures like fragments and run-ons and other types of sentence questions that you might find on the ACT English test. So let's start off by talking about the sentence construction questions. These questions test your knowledge of how sentences and ideas should be joined, separated, or put together. Now, these errors will typically be tested through their clauses. And remember, there are 2 types of clauses: dependent and independent clauses. So 3 of the most frequently tested questions are going to be about fragments and run-ons, misplaced modifiers, and parallelism within the sentence structures. So if we can learn about these 3 types of sentence structures, you're going to ace the sentence questions on the English test. So let's start talking about what fragment and run-on sentences are. Run-on sentences are usually pretty easy to spot because it'll be immediately clear that the sentence is long and confusing. The run-on sentence occurs when independent clauses are joined without any punctuation. Now remember, an independent clause can essentially stand on its own. It has subjects and verbs that agree together, but there's several of them put together into one sentence. Fragments, on the other hand, are incomplete sentences. You're missing a subject or you're missing the verb. So let's take a look at some examples that you might find on the ACT grammar test about fragments and run-ons. At the very low tides of the full moon, when almost all the water was sucked away, we found the hideaways where crabs, snails, starfish, and sea urchins hid. So you can see they've underlined the away with comma and we. So we have these choices B, C, and D, but if we remember from last time, we talked about that the ACT has the no change part. Now, the majority of the time, it's going to be answers B, C, or D. They've made an error and they want to figure out which is the best choice instead. But you can have no change as an answer, which this particular question is. If we start cutting away, trimming the fat of the sentences, the very first thing that we can do is take away the prepositional phrases right at the very beginning of the sentences. You have at the very low tides and of the full moon. Those are prep phrases. They don't need to be in the sentence. So when we start our sentence with when almost all the water was sucked away, that is a dependent clause. It can't stand on its own. So it needs to be attached to an independent clause, and that would be the rest of the sentence. We found the hideaways where the crabs, snails, starfish, and sea urchins hid. Therefore, this is going to be one of those very minor times where you have no change. Let's try another. Due to the limited number of notes that can be played on an antara, early musicians most likely worked in groups, coordinating the timing and pitch of their instruments to extend the range of sounds produced. Now, it took a few breaths for me to go through all of that information. I have a feeling we might have a run-on sentence here, so I don't think this is going to be a no change time. So when we look at our choices we have at the bottom, we do have antara with a comma twice, and then the difference between those 2 are going to be one is possessive in letter C and one is not. And letter D, you don't have a comma, but the possession is then changed. So let's go see if we need a comma. Due to the limited number of notes that can be played on an antara, comma. Early musicians most likely worked in groups. Well, we definitely want a comma there because of the dependent clause that starts with due to the limited number. So we have choices B and C right here. So is our possessive point on letter C still needed? Early musicians most likely worked in groups. The musician's word does not need a possessive there, so we're going to take that apostrophe off and choose letter B. Due to the limited number of notes that can be played on an antara, comma, early musicians, no possessive, most likely worked in groups. The next part we'll be talking about is misplaced modifiers. Modifiers are descriptive words or phrases that are used to add depth or dimension to the phrase that they modify. Modifiers are misplaced if they do not actually refer to what they are modifying. Modifiers can even dangle if you're unsure of what they modify. So remember, because modifiers are descriptive words and phrases that add depth or dimension to the phrase, they're not exactly necessary in the sentence. However, when we look for misplaced modifiers, that particular description should be near what it's describing. So we're going to look to see if the modifiers are in the wrong part of the sentence. Maybe we need to even have punctuation to help them out. Let's look at an example. Because he was tall, Carmelo was a great basketball player. Now, because he was tall is the modifying phrase in the sentence. It tells you why Carmelo was a great ball player. So a modifying phrase generally must be placed directly next to the phrase it is modifying, because if it's not, it's going to get confusing. So let's try an example question from the ACT English portion that works with modifiers. Many years later, living in an upstairs apartment, I am more often sorry I didn't follow my father out to the garden. So now we want to know where the best placement for the underlined portion would be. I am more often sorry. So is it in the right place where it is now, so you'd have the no change, or do we want to put it someplace else? So let's try. Let's see if these modifiers, where they work with. Do we want to say, I am sorry more often I didn't follow my father out to the garden? Well, more often is not modifying I, my subject, so that's not correct. Do we want it after the word follow? I am sorry I didn't follow more often my father out to the garden. Well, the more often is not modifying that you're following your father out. It's not modifying that verb. Do we want to put it after the word garden? I am sorry I didn't follow my father out to the garden more often. So letter D would be correct. We actually want to put more often at the very end of the sentence. We don't want to say more often sorry. It is a confusing relationship with the word sorry. And when we put more often at the end, we relate the modifier to following father to the garden, the entire phrase itself. So letter D would be the correct answer. Another type of sentence structures that you're going to be seeing a lot on the ACT English exam would be parallelism. And in a parallel sentence, all verbs must be in the same form. So when you see a list underlined on the test, look for parallelism errors. So let's take an example from the English portion of the test that works with parallelism. My father was an avid gardener. He still is. And every Saturday morning, he would put on his work clothes, pick up his hoe and trowel, and would head out the back door. Now here the ACT is attempting to confuse you, because remember, when we're watching for parallelism, is everything where it's supposed to be according to tense in the verbs. And we have correct verbiage here when we say, my father was an avid gardener, he still is. Because of those dashes, it is technically correct, but it's trying to confuse you with both past and present tense. But then we have more verbs here. Every Saturday morning, he would put on his work clothes, pick up his hoe and trowel, and would head out the back door. So would put and would head seem to be working until you have that last verb. Pick up his hoe and trowel. You can probably tell already it's incorrect. I can't even say it correctly. Pick up his hoe and trowel and would head out the back door. Pick up, P-I-C-K, the verb pick is a present tense verb. That would be incorrect with my father was, past tense. He would put, past tense. He would head, past tense. So we need to change that over to letter B. Every Saturday morning, he would put on his work clothes, picked up his hoe and trowel, and would head out the back door. Our next example. The few times that I've helped a friend with yard work have given me the joy of touching the soil with an open palm, to get the earth under my fingernails, of patting down the berm around a newly transplanted sapling. So let's start looking at your verbs. The few times that I have helped a friend. So we're in past participle here with the have helped. Have given, once again, that past participle. Have given me the joy of touching the soil with an open palm. But then we change over to get. To get the earth under my fingernails, of patting down. So we have all these past tenses, but to get the earth underneath my fingernails is present tense. So we want to change over to of getting. So it matches up or modifies with the of patting. The few times that I've helped a friend with yard work have given me the joy of touching the soil with an open palm, of getting the earth under my fingernails, of patting down the berm around a newly transplanted sapling. Your best choice here would be letter C. Now, continuing on in the English portion of the ACTs, we also see there will be rhetorical skills questions. The rhetorical skills comprise 35 of the 75 questions in the English section, and those are going to be split up into 3 categories. You're going to have writing strategies, organization, and style questions. Now, this involves improving the effectiveness of a passage through revision and editing. The writing questions will test your ability to identify effective topic sentences, to flesh out a paragraph through adding evidence, and to determine the passage's overall purpose. Let's take a look at an example. As a 10-year-old, I was supremely unenthusiastic about swinging a hoe in the garden when I could be out playing with my friends. Having tried and failed, my father was unable to make a gardener out of me. So now we want to look at the context of the writing and ask which of the choices best emphasizes how much the father wanted his son to share his avid interest in gardening. Well, we know as a 10-year-old he was supremely unenthusiastic. He does not want to garden. Having tried and failed, my father was unable to make a gardener out of me. It sounds like Dad tried. So we have, with our unlikely wanting to swing a hoe in the garden and Dad having tried and failed, we're going to be looking at which of the choices best emphasize. Letter B, because of my indifference to his hobby. C, contrary to his thinking. D, despite his repeated attempts. Well, having tried and failed, your best option probably is D. Despite his repeated attempts essentially means the same thing as saying having tried and failed. Despite his repeated attempts, my father was unable to make a gardener out of me. The next part we'll look at are the organization questions. Now, these questions deal with the logical structuring of the passage on the level of the sentence, the paragraph, and the passage as a whole. Now, these organizational questions ask you to organize sections to maximize their coherence, their order, and their unity. Let's try an example. So it's going to ask you which of the following sequences of sentences makes this paragraph most logical. How do we want this paragraph to read? Often, my brother and I joined our mother on her adventures into tidal lands. At the very low tides of the full moon, when almost all the water was sucked away, we found the hideaways where crabs, snails, starfish, and sea urchins hid in order not to be seen. Sometimes we would dig with shovels in the mud, where yellow worms lived in their leathery tunnels. chances are you probably don't want to change this out. You have essentially a topic sentence for sentence number 1. Often my brother and I joined our mother on her adventures into tidal lands, and sentences 2 and 3 describe what your brother, you, and your mother are doing in those tidal lands. So this is another one of those very minor times in which you would choose a no change. We talked about this in part 1, in which approximately 20 to 25% of the time, the ACT will give you a no change answer. And then lastly, the style questions. Style questions generally concern the use of effective word choice in terms of tone and clarity. These questions test your ability to choose the most appropriate word for a sentence in terms of its tone, clarity, or redundancy. Sometimes the sentence is just written poorly. So a tip, the ACT English loves short newspaper type writing. When it comes to editing sentences, the shortest answer is usually right, but be careful, as long as it makes sense. So let's look at an example. Having studied, my mother is a marine biologist. So we probably want to pick the short and sweet style of sentence to see if that one works first, and that would be letter D. My mother is a marine biologist. Now you can try letters B and C. All three technically say the same thing that the example sentence does, but when we look for style, we want to be short, sweet, and to the point. Letter B, as my mother's interest is science, she is a marine biologist, it makes sense, but it's very clunky. We don't need to have all of that sentence there. My mother's occupation is that of a marine biologist. Again, technically correct grammatically. However, we don't need to have marine biologist and mother's occupation together. There's this understanding that a marine biologist is an occupation. So your best choice here is letter D. Now, how do we know what would be the correct answer? If I go through this, can I go through it fast? Yes, this is one of the areas of the test where you might want to try the PO method, the process of elimination. When you have a question with multiple errors, try to spot one error and use your process of elimination. Maybe perhaps you're not quite used to using possession, but maybe you're good at contractions. So if you look at the first sentence, maybe you can cross off that particular one with Kathy's friends left their bags in the room, because the word there is possessive towards bags. So already I can use with it my process of elimination. That first sentence is incorrect. Now I also know a bit of my possessive parts because I know that friends has the word Kathy's as a possessive. So the third choice, Kathy's friends left their bags in the room, is incorrect as well. I need to have an apostrophe S for Kathy to be possessive of Kathy's friends. So now that I only have parts B and D, my options now for Kathy's are both the same. So now do I want their bags, the part D with the possession, they left their bags possessively in the room? Or do I want to use the word there as in the placement of the bags? Well, I know their bags were left in the room, so I already know where they're placed. Therefore, letter D, Kathy's friends left their bags in the room, possessive and possessive words. D is the correct choice. Again, now don't be afraid to use a no change when they give it to you. Actually, this is the correct answer approximately 20 to 25% of the time on the ACT. A lot of times students think, well, they just thrown that in there and they're not going to use that. The ACT does use it, but obviously not a majority of the time. The answer choice that you might see every once in a while on the ACT, omit. Omit means what is underlined should be removed. So if they give you the choice to omit a certain word or a certain phrase, that means you are removing that particular part of the sentence. Use that when you know that the passage reads better with the redundant or irrelevant parts of the statement eliminated. Now, when we take a look at the no change being the correct answer about 1/4 of the time that it appears, that is a good choice to think about to get rid of for your process of elimination. Also, you might want to choose a letter of the day. If you are just thinking with my process of elimination, I'm still confused, I don't know. If the question is going to be too hard or too time consuming, use a letter of the day and move on. Maybe perhaps for the ACT you've decided if I don't know the answer to the question, everything is now the letter A, or everything is now the letter D. Always read to the end of the sentence before working the question. Otherwise, you cannot correctly judge whether the ideas are complete or incomplete. Again, you're working on the English portion of the ACT. You're supposed to read the entire sentence and be looking for errors. So unlike maybe perhaps the reading comprehension where you might just be skimming a passage if reading is a good subject for you, you need to read all the way to the end of the sentence in this particular part of the test. And also think of punctuation as traffic signals, a stop and a go. If you're thinking or seeing punctuation such as colons, semicolons, they're telling you that those are independent clauses. Those ideas could stand on their own with a period at the end. A comma is separating a dependent clause or it's listing something. So that one is pausing. Now, if you cannot cite a reason to use a comma, don't use it. One thing that we find for most students when you go through high school is that students have a tendency to place a lot of commas where they don't need to be. So if you don't know the reason why a comma is supposed to be there, it's probably not useful at that point. You might also be seeing idioms, which are figures of speeches that follow no rules on the ACTs. Most idioms on the ACT involve a prepositional phrase. Because we have more than just people who speak English as a first language taking the ACT, idioms are not something that is critical or crucial for learning for the ACT. So if you see idioms or figures of speech being used, chances are those are prepositional phrases and they are not going to relate on the English test whatsoever. It is something that you can cross off and trim the fat out of that sentence. If you can count something, like say perhaps dollars, use the words fewer, number, and many. If you can't count something like cash, use less, amount, and much, and more will work with both. Now, unlike the word no change, if they're using the word omit in one of your answers, omit is correct half the time it appears. Again, the ACT is really good at giving long sentences with too much information, and the correct answers are usually short newspaper report type sentences. So if you see the word omit, usually 50% of the time, that's the correct answer. Check that answer out. Does it seem logical in this instance? Because it might actually be the correct answer. Now, the ACT also plays favorites with verbs, pronouns, apostrophes, and transitions. Transitional phrases and your fanboys like and, but, for, nor, all of those need commas. So they like to play a lot with transitions to see if you understand comma placements. Because they're working a lot with subject and verb agreements, they're going to play a lot with the verbs past tense, past perfect tense, participles, your future tenses. So be careful with your verb agreements. Lastly, they also like working a lot with pronouns and apostrophes. Apostrophes for possession, that is one of the most often commonly misused mistakes in English grammar. So they like to see whether or not you know when something is possessive and whether or not it needs an apostrophe S, an S apostrophe, and whether or not you know the correct pronoun or gender for a particular noun. So when we talk about the pronouns and the verb agreements, a lot of times they're looking at the singulars and plurals. Now, usually the most common error in the area of singulars and plurals is the use of they. So let's take a look at an example. When a friend borrows my car, I usually ask them to fill it with gas before they return it. It sounds correct. However, you have a friend, one person, singular. Therefore, them and they that are plural pronouns are incorrect. So if you wanted to use the words them and they, you have to have a plural subject. When friends borrow my car, I usually ask them to fill it with gas before they return it. Thank you so much for stopping by to learn more about the English grammar portion of the ACT. Again, I have 3 parts to this particular video. If you want to continue on working with me on the grammar section, stay tuned. Otherwise, go back and check out my part 1 video in which I talked a little bit about the grammar of ACT in particular and also talked about subject and verb agreements and punctuation. Please subscribe to our Learning Language Arts channel, and thanks for watching.